from Outserve. I'll do the introductions. That will save everyone. Phil is from Outserve, they are an implementer of ours. He knows a lot of customers in a lot of sectors, and he knows a lot about apps and integrations. Josh is in my team. We're sat next to each other. He's in the room next door, and he's been with us. Yes, just there. He's been with us the longest and is our very senior consultant and heads up the sales team. He knows I don't really want Josh to say anything, which I know will be very difficult for him. But what I don't want us to do is if we do go down a technical route and you guys do want some support to talk about Unleashed and how we might use Unleashed to help supply chain resilience, I don't want there not to be people in the room that can answer that for you. But I don't. This is not a software discussion. I want to make that really, really clear. I want to lift this discussion above and beyond software, but those two guys can certainly help us. If I move on to Sam, and that's the final non-customer, if you like. So Sam, you're from Australia, have I got that right?
Yeah, I'm Australian.
So you're in London with Young Foodies and have a supply chain background practically and also from a sort of fixer point of view. I think that's how you described yourself to me. Was that true?
Yeah, most of my job is fixing problems. Love it.
Love it. And then we're joined fantastically by three quite different customers. Ben from Minor Figures, I think probably the largest customer on the call, he's waving now, and has a lot of users in a lot of countries. And so you're GM for EMEA, have I got that right?
That's right, yeah.
And then in no particular order, I'll go Daniel because he was first on the call from all the customers. Daniel's driving from west to east in Scotland, and he is responsible, head of supply chain for Mara Seaweed. And they're a sustainable sort of seasoning company. Very exciting to talk about what they're doing. And then David at the bottom, David Press, am I right?
Yeah.
And working with and have been for a while with Beyond Alcohol. What do you prefer? How do you describe yourself? Is it Three Spirit or Beyond Alcohol? What do you normally say?
Beyond Alcohol's the parent group. Three Spirit's the brand.
Okay, so you would say Beyond Alcohol probably.
Yeah.
Okay. If dealing with the effects of Brexit and the pandemic weren't enough, and the developments in Ukraine have conspired to create the perfect storm of disruption, on top of navigating the seismic shifts that the pandemic brought, such as the on-trade disappearing and losing those hard-fought supermarket listings, we're now likely to encounter increasing costs, heating, transport, ultimately affecting the price of raw materials and lengthening lead times. Arguably, Brexit, COVID, and the war will have a long-term effect on the business models of our food and drinks companies. We're already seeing indications that our own customers are moving away from a just-in-time supply chain. Our own analysis of nearly 600 Smee manufacturers found that the overall value of stock has risen by 34% between 2020 and 2022. 80% of those sectors analysed showed a steady or steep rise in stock value, and food and beverage was in the steep rises category at 110%. Some commentators are suggesting that this isn't necessarily a negative development, and in the longer term could provide plenty of new opportunities, particularly for SMEs. So, are we witnessing the start of a shift to a more localized supply chains or key trusted international partners, which are far less risky and logistically easier to manage? Whilst there are no right answers, we've some serious supply chain know-how in this virtual room, and I'm keen for us to share some of the success stories of the last 24 months and to unpack and discuss some of those challenges that remain. So I'm going to kick you all off with a very quick fire round of questions, just so everyone has a chance to talk, and then a couple of more open-ended questions, which we'll spend the next half hour on. So first question, what does SME supply chain resilience mean to you? I'm going to go straight for Sam to give you guys, to not put the customers on the spot just yet, but I'm going to go for Sam first. Take it away, Sam.
Sure, thanks, Bryony. So supply chain resilience, I guess the way we would take it from a consultancy point of view is we would like to understand someone's network design, lead times, stock they need to hold, aspirations over a 12 and 24-month forecast, and then assess whether it's going to line up together to make it work. I think we find that a lot of challenger brands that we work with, or just a lot of challenger brands in general, generally their supply chain is the weakest part of their link, because what you tend to find in challenger and small brands is that founders are very often product development specialists or marketeers or salespeople. They're very switched on. They're very in tune with the market, but they don't tend to come from operational backgrounds. So it can often be a real dark spot for them when they're starting to run their business. And there's a very different kettle of fish from, a tabletop kitchen sort of operation where you're producing a small number of products on, like really limited runs, to scaling up into line trials and factory trials. And, then you land a Tesco and you've got 1,400 stores, and it's just like things tend to fall apart right there, right then. And people are often blind to the requirements of a supply chain, their supply chain needs. So generally, there's a lot of education around supply chain, and usually people have to walk through the fire and get burnt before they decide that their supply chains are kind of important. And I think there's a fundamental misconception about what supply chains do for challenger brands. And I think that most people see it as a cost on their P&L, whereas, I'm a supply chain consultant, but I would see it as an investment, because if you can't put your product on a shelf, which is what your supply chain does, I would say, do you even have a product? And, that would be the fundamental thing, and you might be like, oh yeah, I've got 2 weeks supply in a warehouse and my manufacturer can just make more whenever I want it. But do you actually know that? Does your manufacturer actually have 2-week lead times to produce, your next run of product? Do you actually know that your manufacturer can get in, I don't know, the sugar, the carrots, the whatever it is you need? Do you know what your manufacturer's lead times are this very second to get your products made? And generally we find that, sorry, Bryony, you're trying to say something?
I'm gonna, because it was a quick fire round.
Sorry.
I'm going to stop you there, and I'm going to move on to David. Do you want to pick up what it means to you?
Yeah, I'd allude to a lot of what Sam said and agree. Some of the challenges that we have, though, whilst you try to perfect your own supply chain, and you're absolutely right, understand lead times, understand flexibility within that. Some of the biggest challenges we have now is everybody's supply chain is being impacted. And so your supplier who was supplying 2 weeks ago on a lead time of 4 weeks is now supplying on 8 weeks. And almost you can find that those lead times are just being thrown out of the water. And to try to get that security, that stability, it's about perfecting those relationships with your suppliers, gaining as much flexibility as you possibly can, and doing it in a way that both ensures consistent supply, but at a cost that is agreeable. Because the other thing that has been seen over the course of certainly the last year massively, costs are only going one way across ingredients, transport, energy, it's going to have a knock-on effect at the end of the day to the consumer, and it's about how we try to create that consistency at a consumer level as well. Daniel,
are you seeing similar things to David? I assume you are.
Absolutely, and I think that everyone being buffeted and the lead times and costs for every supplier is such an issue. We're trying to plan ahead. We got a grant last year, and that all had to be very carefully costed. We'd spent this much doing these pieces of work. Those costs are out the window. We're getting quotes now for pieces of work or for operational supply things we need, and they're saying, look, accept this quote within a week or 2 weeks, otherwise the price will change again. Whereas before, a quote's good for 30 days, and you can think a bit more long term about what the price is going to be coming down the line. Again, energy was mentioned. We use a reasonable amount of energy, sort of the drying of the seaweeds, and that's one of our biggest supply chain costs. So there's all the turbulence coming in, and then the question is, what price flexibility do you have on the product going out? How much of those costs do you need to be able to absorb or mitigate, or think of other ways to do it, versus how much will you in turn be forced to pass on? It's very challenging. But I guess resilience is being able to keep your fundamental operations going in the face of all that.
Very good. Nicely summed up at the end there. Ben, how are you finding, how would you define supply chain resilience in the current climate?
Yeah, it's tricky. I'd echo a lot of what's been said. I think, in our business, we've got the complexity of 14 SKUs selling in 40 countries through 3 regional offices, and a business that is sort of at a growth rate of doubling in size every 8 to 10 months. So it's that alone is very challenging and puts a huge amount of strain on supply. When you then add a really challenging backdrop to that, which you talked about earlier, that just adds to the pressure. And I think Sam's really right in that the tendency in a lot of scale ups and startups is to really chase sales metrics and top line sales numbers. And often supply can be a bit of a secondary thought, but of course, if you don't have supply, then those sales just collapse. So I think the key is about that nimbleness and agility as you scale, and the ability to take on that turbulence that was mentioned earlier. So for me, that's people, systems, and planning, and that's how you build in resilience from the start.
So let's come back to that. I think when we move on to scaling in this climate, we'll start with you to remind me of that. So thank you all. Phil, do you want to chip in here? Do you have anything to add? Because obviously you run your own business and you manage tens.
I just wanted to very quickly probably agree again with Ben and Sam, and just talk about, we're nearly always early stage working with founders and finance teams who are driven by sales and marketing and oftentimes, of course, cash flow, and supply chain is an afterthought until they get burnt. I think someone mentioned that, and then unfortunately the solution that initial burn is to go and buy enormous amounts of stock or hold enormous amounts of stock, which then gives another set of challenges, which then we've got all the cash flow tied up, we've got a lot of stock which could be going out. So it really is getting burnt on both sides of it that we see, because of the not understanding supply chain resilience and focusing, as I say, on sales, marketing and cash flow.
Thank you. So next question, and what I wanted to just, before we go on to kind of what we've all been doing about this and sharing those wins, hopefully, in Smee Food and Bev particularly, what does it look like? And can you say if it's different from other sectors or compared to larger businesses? So I might start with Daniel on this one, because I know you've been in other sectors outside of food and bev. Do you feel like, from your experience at Mara Seaweed, that supply chain resilience is fundamentally different for Smee and compared to larger businesses as well?
I think so. Now, obviously, I don't know what's happening in the pharma industry now. I know every industry is going to be having its challenges. I think one of the things I noticed as a Smee is our bargaining position is clearly much lower. You sort of come at the end of the queue rather than at the front of the queue. So you sort of you have to be prepared more, I guess, to accept the prices that are going and the timelines you're given. Now, that doesn't mean you can't sort of discuss and negotiate and find the best options, but that's something to contend with. I also think we're in a very sort of nascent industry, so this is talking about us specifically in seaweed. So we're getting there with maturity. Some of our suppliers are, depending on what we're getting, but also some of our suppliers are less mature. So in a way, we're all looking at each other in a more cooperative way to understand, well, if this falls over, this falls over. So how do we compete? How are we all sort of getting the best prices for ourselves, the best deals for ourselves and so forth, but how are we also doing it in a way that will allow the industry as a whole to sort of grow and to follow the trajectory that it's hoped and anticipated to. So yes, quite a different environment for a couple of reasons, I'd say.
That's interesting, the what you're saying about being sort of last in the queue, but ultimately kind of cooperating and pulling together to try and overcome that. Is anyone else experiencing that kind of Smee solidarity?
Yeah, I think I certainly have been speaking with direct competitors about best ways of introducing yourselves to the marketplace. There have been opportunities there. I think going back to some of the things that Phil touched on, you know, as a business, as an SME, you know, you're looking at funding and whether you've raised, you know, internally or by going out to, investors. If your plans are based on a, you know, projection of one thing and they've invested in your business, and then over the course of a year, the supply chain and operations are changing so rapidly that what was expected in terms of that investment has now had to be tied up in working capital or something along those lines. Now, you know, at the end of the day, it will drive cash at the end. However, the expectation of, you know, funding or investment perhaps in marketing or sales has had to be tied up, because unless you do, you don't have a product to sell. So there's been some significant decisions that have had to be made, and you go in with your eyes open when you're making them. But certainly as a business, you know, we've upped our inventory, both on finished goods and in terms of our materials as well. And not only that, you know, invest in systems and processes that enable you to try to control and coordinate and manage that investment.
I do want to talk about systems, and I will come back to that. Ben, how are you finding it as a larger SME? I suppose have you worked outside of food and bev? You're like Mr. Food and Bev if we cut you in half.
Yeah, I'm afraid I've got
small and very large, you know, and a much, on that cusp, aren't you? A very large SME.
Yeah, I think we are. I don't unfortunately have any experience outside food and bev. From the age of 13, I've been scooping ice creams and God knows what else. So, but I guess what I do know is that if I look at the UK as a percent of our living costs as consumers, food is very, very, very cheap. It's incredibly cheap. And in this environment, that means real pressure on businesses. Working capital, David talked about, is got to be tied up in additional stock holding and supply, and that has a real potential detrimental effect on businesses. So I think we will, and we are already seeing it, but we will see real inflation coming through in food. I think there's talk about baked beans going up by 5p a can, but I think real inflation is going to come through from all categories and all sectors, and it has to. And it might not be a bad thing if prices do rise to a more sustainable level, because businesses can't operate at pumping out quality cheap food at the rate it's being made at the moment. So I think that's the pressure I see, which is probably quite unique to food and bev. I know my wife's an architect, and there's huge cost increases in building materials and construction. So I know it's being felt in other sectors, but I think it's really acute in food and bev.
Sam, are you seeing the same with your community?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, we work with a lot, mainly food and bev, but we also do some consumer goods stuff and some personal care stuff and things like that. And raw material lead times can be just, what was 2 to 4 weeks is now 14 to 16 weeks. And it's very hard to build supply chain models when you're dealing with shifting times all the time. You put a PO in, you expect it to be 8 weeks, and you get told it's 16 weeks at the other side, and your manufacturer is geared up to do a production run based on initial lead times, and everything just goes out the window. So yeah, look, relationships at the moment are so crucial. Your 3PLs, your manufacturer, if you're not like best friends with those people at the moment, you need to start becoming best friends with them, because I think that's the only way one of the only ways to mitigate this as well. And there's huge global challenges. Shipping containers are all in the wrong spot. COVID threw everything for a loop. Stuff stopped working during COVID. Everything got turned upside down. Maersk's prices have gone up. Everyone's shipping prices have gone through the roof in the last 12 months, and it will continue to go up for as long as they can push it up, because those shipping rates were not moving for the last 15 years other than inflation. So the shipping lines are loving it because they can force prices right now. And that's, if you look at air freight and shipping prices, you're talking 6, 8, 10 multiples of what it was, 18 months ago. And, so much cost is flowing through to to brands and consequently consumers. And we're just in a high inflation moment, like it is what it is. And we're in a pendulum swing, aren't we? Because, huge contraction in global economies with coronavirus. Money gets pumped into the system by governments at a state level. We're talking trillions of dollars pumped into the economies. And have we come out the other side? Everyone's been saving money. Well, people who kept their jobs have been saving money, and now there's heaps of money flooding the system. And so inflation therefore has to follow. So we are in a pendulum moment. It was very much one way 18 months ago, and it's very much the other way at the moment. It will swing back, but who knows when.
So just moving on. So the next subject I want to do, thank you for all those thoughts. Just so stay with you, Sam, because you touched on it there. You were talking about, relationships being key. What I want to do is go around the room and go, what are your top 1 or 2 strategies or priorities for supply chain resilience? And you may not have thought about it in that way before, but I suspect we are all doing that. If I start with Sam, because you sort of touched on it there, and I feel like you can continue with it.
Yeah, sure. So I think Daniel mentioned that, sometimes you feel like you're at the back of the queue when you're a small a small client to a manufacturer. The way I would approach that is, look, your line time's being used for your big guys at this rate, but, let us fill your gaps, let's get you to optimal line time, and get us in on the line for those little gaps where you can fit us in between runs and things like that. Try to be as agile as you can, because that's your one advantage as a small brand or a Smee, is that you can be super agile in this environment. And you should be looking for contingency solutions with other manufacturers. And what does it take to get you on the line between those big runs? How can you accelerate that and make their efficiency better? Can you work with your manufacturer to is there a way to take 1 or 2 people off the line and lower their costs? So I was in a call the other day, and it was a really good chat. It was like, you shouldn't be trying to steal your manufacturer's margins. You shouldn't be trying to pick their pocket of their 10% that they're going to make. You should be looking at their 90% cost base and being like, how can we trim your costs? Because you win, I win when that happens. And that's where you can, you have the advantage of potentially lowering costs for yourselves as well. So yeah, that would be my approach at all times. And, beers and chocolates and, handshakes and dinners, they go a long way. When you need a favor on a line and the factory manager remembers you because you dropped them some beers, it honestly does help. It really does.
Tickets to football now opened up again, rugby.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not much of a football fan, but yeah, it's whatever it takes. Literally, if you go around and shake someone's hand and you know their name and you've dropped them some beers, honestly, they will remember you and they will appreciate you.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, and certainly one point to make, though, that Sam's obviously talking about, which I completely agree with what he's saying, but to do that, inventory is key, and if you don't have ingredients, you can't have that agility to be able to slot into the gaps that may suddenly appear on production lines. So to work with manufacturers, and the one thing that we've been able to do, source our ingredients, get those into stock, so that when there are gaps, or if there is flexibility required, because not only that, the manufacturers you're working with, they will have other SMEs going out and saying, I'm sorry, I can't get my ingredient to run my production run that's scheduled in X weeks time. Well, if we've got stock there and we've got the ingredients, then use us. Let us be that person who can be flexible for you as well. And like I said, build those relationships, because they'll be grateful for you to enable them to push another customer back an extra couple of weeks, take your slot, bring you forward. And those favors will get repaid at some point in the future. Ben, from a sort of slightly larger end of the market, top 1 or 2 priorities or strategies for supply chain resilience?
Yeah, I think upskilling and growing team has been key for us. So that's been about going from a supply team of 1 to to a fully built out supply team with process and procedure, and a real tight focus on particularly on forecasting and S&OP process. So that's been number 1. I think just to be a parrot, that relationship with external manufacturing partners and 3PLs is really, really key. For us, a journey from being a very small brand to being quite a sizable brand is also a mindset shift in the manufacturer's relationship with us. It's no longer about them doing us a favor. but more about us being their partner. So I think building, running, and keeping that relationship tight is been pretty key for us. So those would be the top two, has been the team and the relationship with the external manufacturers.
I'm just having a look. Is it Phil, when you're working with your clients, is there anything that you can bring to the table?
Well, on this, obviously, I'm just going to go for the obvious one and have good systems. And clearly, we still see a lot of people who don't know what they've got in stock, don't know what their requirement for production planning is, before they've got these good systems in. Now clearly, you're never going to be able to work any of these strategies very well without having that. So we're going to go for the foundations. Let's get some good systems into, at least you can see what you've got, see where the gaps are and everything else. Obviously not relevant to the guys on this call, but we are speaking to a lot of those people still who just haven't got that vision, cannot see, and then that's a painful place to be.
Daniel, can you still hear us?
Yeah, I certainly can.
Any thought?
I think they're all very valid points. I think the relationship thing absolutely is key. Obviously, we need to be doing that. And I mentioned the challenge of being a SME. I guess an advantage of being a SME is that you can build those relationships, and people are perhaps interested in your brand and your company and your ambition and what you're trying to do in a way that does foster interest and good intentions that can be built on. In terms of your question of what's our sort of key to ensure supply chain resilience, we're very reliant on our raw product, which is wet seaweed, which obviously, if you're single source and there's any disruption, then that's a risk to the whole business model. So dual sourcing is probably the key thing we're doing, which is we do our own wild harvesting, we're putting our own farm in place, and then we're working with other farmers. We're trying to bring that into Scotland as far as possible. We have worked with overseas suppliers previously, and that all feeds in, I think, into this wider conversation about resilience and managing costs and managing inflation, which is you can ensure greater resilience and redundancy by having more sources being dual sourced, having more inventory, but obviously there's a cost to doing all that. So what's the balance to strike between staying relatively lean and keeping costs down and accepting slightly higher costs for that security?
So looking at what we can control, then just want to talk a few minutes about sort of I suppose stock. And so in the reading that I've done, something else that may be helpful for supply chain resilience is rationalizing your stock, looking at those that perhaps don't have the higher margins, or got a question here around how do you manage stock levels on your most important products? Does anybody want to pick, Ben, so you're nodding then, do you want to pick up on that one?
Yeah, can do. I mean, we intentionally have kept our SKU count and range tight. From a slightly different angle, from a commercial angle, we want to keep a lot of the good credit we have with buyers by hopefully just focusing on a really tight range of top selling products. So constantly reviewing that we don't carry a tail in our range of poor performing lines is pretty key. I guess we also in the past, where we were a smaller business, kept a much leaner stock holding, but we've as we've grown, we've actually just recently increased our average base stock holding by about 20%. For us, there's a lot of pressure, particularly in the recent events in Ukraine, which is an arable bed. It's also the home of most sunflower oil, for instance, that's found in the UK, and sunflower oil features in most dairy alternatives. So that's an issue for us for sure. So yeah, we've been maintaining a much bigger inventory position. We just to add the pressure to the team, we just launched nationally into Tesco last week, which adds a whole dimension of pressure. So it's expensive, you know, it's tying up a lot of cash. We're holding additional stock. We work to quite a tight tunnel of inventory that, you know, we want to keep in stock, and that might be 4 to 6 weeks. But when your performance needle is constantly moving, you know, it's really tough to get a read on what 4 to 6 weeks of stock actually looks like. So I think Phil talked about having those foundations of visibility. That's really key. Making sure good data is going in so that you can get good data back out the other end and have real clear visibility of what your position is in performance and stock holding. So yeah, a lot of extra pressure on inventory and having to hold additional inventory at the moment.
David, similar question to you. So, I mean, from a SKU count point of view, have you been doing any rationalization? When do you look at, do you have triggers or reorder reports? Sort of, how often do you look at all that stuff and rationalize and go back to the drawing board?
I mean, our business at the moment is only limited to 3 variants. Now we've got both UK and US labels, and we've got 2 sizes of products, but fundamentally the liquid that goes in our bottles, there's 3 different sorts. We're actually in the process of launching a new product, and perhaps whilst a lot of our recipes are complicated, you know, we thrive on the functional capabilities of our products, and to be that point of difference, we work with some fairly obscure ingredients. And whilst the founders and developers will go out and, you know, love the fact that they can use, you know, cacao husks from a single source Peruvian rainforest type farmer, in terms of, whilst it might be sustainable in terms of environment, sustainable in terms of supply chain, it can drive complexity and challenge. For instance, one of the products that we use, yerba mate, we're finding that we've got sources that are coming in from, or were coming in from Russia. All of a sudden, obviously, we've got some challenges there. And takes me back to when previous life working with Britvic, they formulated a pomegranate juice just before the Iraq war. And obviously it's the Middle East is the key supply region for pomegranate. So we need to be careful about what it is we're doing. But I think, you need to stay true to your brand and to what you believe in as a brand. And whilst, not necessarily go down that single source, one farm in, a kibbutz in Israel to supply you the ingredients, but be aware of it, be cognizant of it. And if you feel that you do need to reformulate, don't be afraid to. Certainly, I think, some of the conversations we've had around the new product launches, we're taking that into effect to ensure scalability, because I think when the business started a few years ago, it was seen as we can be this niche, we can grow. Now, all of a sudden, we have grown from where we were to where we are now. And we can see that if we were to triple the size of our business again in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to need to have a far easier supply chain and a far easier source of supply of those ingredients to ensure that we can actually deliver that growth.
Great advice. Daniel, did you hear that? Did you want to pick up on it? I mean, you've got your own challenges as well, but obviously, and have you got like your SKU is, you've got different flavors and different sizes, and you've also got international, haven't you?
Yeah, and that's what I was going to touch on. I think the advantage we have is we use sort of 4 essential seaweed species, and they've got a good shelf life when we hold them in whole leaf or flake form. So that's quite simple to manage. What we then have is a range of, as you say, flakes, powders, smoked, not smoked, blends. We do things like a seaweed butter. So we use a blend that we use a butter manufacturer to make that up. We've got MPD coming down the line. And as I mentioned in my mail, we've got quite a big growth trajectory that we need to prepare for. So what I'm focusing on doing is we do need to build that inventory, but holding it as far back as possible in work in process. So holding it in in the single species leaf or powder flake form, so that as we drop SKUs or introduce new SKUs or launch new products, we've got the flexibility at the finished good end to be as flexible as possible, whilst keeping that deep reserve, I guess, in terms of the work in progress material, which is how we're approaching it.
Great stuff. I do want to move on to, you mentioned it there, Daniel, scaling. Is there anything, so I've got a question here just to finish off perhaps on mitigating risk topic. Does anyone measure, sort of how do you measure resiliency? How do you monitor it? And are there any sacrifices you're having to make to be more resilient? Sam, do you want to start us off on that one?
Sure. So, I mean, we work with brands from anywhere from run rates of 250,000 a year right up to 30 million a year. So it's very different depending on where in the stratosphere you sit and what your strategic aims are for that business cycle and how far ahead you need to plan. Obviously, a small business is probably looking on a 3, 6, and 12-month horizon maximum. And as you scale up, you start to blow that out to at least 24, maybe even 36 months. Obviously, challenging at the moment with what's going on in the world. We tend to ask people we would tend to push people to run a supply chain audit when they're trying to retail ramp. Like, it's very different from a kitchen table to a retail solution. So we would do like a ready to supply audit, and we would really encourage people to just know exactly the ground they stand upon. They're cognizant of the fact that the ground is constantly shifting at the moment. So it's not just that simple, but you really need to get like a baseline understanding of what you can and can't do, what your requirements are, and where you stand at any one time. We would generally say that's a really strong thing to do. It does take time, it does cost money, and not all brands have that time or that money, but you can steer yourself onto the rocks if you don't know where you stand. And that's just a fundamental thing I would say. Like, you can do the work yourself, like you can hire someone, an outside advisor, to do it for you, but like, where do you stand and do you know where that is? And but a lot of challenger brands who are just coming out of, from tabletop to retail, they often don't. And that would be like the key thing I would say to them, like, just know that inside out.
Good advice. Phil, on that topic of kind of monitoring and any sacrifices the clients have perhaps made, I mean, obviously from an IT point of view, you probably have some thoughts on this.
Again, I think, it's just, sorry to be a crap record, but obviously to get that sort of reporting, you're going to need the systems in place, and again, garbage in, garbage out. And that's where we are looking at, again, getting the most out of some of the reporting tools that we've got and working with the supply chain people in the businesses. But as I say, that a lot of this is very new to founders and finance. So lots of learning curve. So I think there is, again, reaching out to the professionals and the other people who can support them in this.
Daniel, supply chain, monitoring it, and is that something, I suspect it's not something that SMEs have a lot of time for?
No, and it's interesting, we talked earlier about sort of moving from a big organisation to a smaller organisation. When I joined this company, supply chain, forward planning and so forth, there were informal discussions between supply chain and what you might call the commercial, the sales team, and a bit of a sort of finger in the air, when should we order and how much. And I've tried to bring in a much more structured sales and operations planning, so SNOP monthly cycle process, which it does require a little bit of legwork and governance, which a SME doesn't always necessarily have the time and resource and what to do. But I found that really valuable, particularly as we are starting to grow, to on that monthly basis have the commercial and the supply chain sides of the room talking to each other to understand, is the sales trajectory sort of going as anticipated? What's the supply chain position? How strong are we to support those sales? What happens if they go up and down? And to keep that conversation alive, and so to be able to adjust sort of as agilely as possible to what the business needs are. We're still running that, trialing it, seeing how it goes, but personally I found that to be a really helpful thing to do.
Interesting. And David, so you've got Sam talking about auditing to start with, a benchmark, and then you've got Daniel talking about sort of monthly planning meetings. Is that something that you would also do?
Yeah, so it's something that we've sort of started to look at implementing. The majority of our business is done on a D2C basis, and so we are at the mercy of TikTok and a number of other channels where, you know, our forecast can get absolutely smashed out of the water.
Can I just say, from a marketing point of view, your TikTok channels is one of the best TikTok channels I've ever seen, and I shared it around everyone here in New Zealand because I thought you were smashing it.
Thank you.
No wonder you have trouble your end.
Yes, what we have got is a group of people who absolutely love the development, the marketing, and going out and engaging with, you know, influencers and even just our consumer base. But we've had instances where our consumer base has decided to pull a video together, put it on TikTok, and it's gone viral, and all of a sudden it's taken us out.
Thank you very much.
Which a fantastic engagement with the community. But when you are small and growing, and you are, you know, putting product down, expecting it to last you a period of time, and finding that it's gone in half of that horizon, you're then left with awkward conversations with the sales team and the founders, and some fairly, you know, poor strategic positioning with your manufacturing and ingredient people, where you're basically just trying to get ingredients in. And that's been, you know, perhaps, you know, one of the drivers for us, and we go back to the inventory build and stock build, one of the drivers for us at the same time as all of the other global challenges that have come on board, because, you know, we want to be in a position that despite the doom and gloom of what's going on in and around the world, we've got consumers and we've got, you know, people who want to engage with our products. And so we want to try to give ourselves the best opportunity to do that.
Brilliant. Anything else that, before we move on to, we've touched on it several times, so I want to actually devote some time to it before we run out of time.
And I just mention, you know, Ronnie, that I think even just, you know, your basic numbers, your basic data that we see clients on is sort of, you know, minimum stock levels, you know, lead times, days to replenish. They just haven't got that basic information. And until they start putting the time and effort into understanding that, and then when they do put the information in, like those, they're often wrong, which leads to real problems when you get your wrong minimum levels that first time that, you know, they run the reorder report and suddenly, you know, they're buying the wrong thing. It's getting that data right and understanding those, you know, you need to put the work and effort into those and just start with the basics.
Yeah, good shout. Good shout. Okay, thank you for that. First half hour, I've run over slightly, but I was really keen to get everyone's thoughts on the table. And obviously, the longer we talk, the more goodness comes up, bubbles to the surface.